Aziraphale writes his own human AU fanfiction. A Good Omens fanfiction by Starful Dust. Read by Jukebox Draws. Summary. Crowley has suspected that Aziraphale could be an amazing writer if he wanted to be, but he isn't totally prepared for when he accidentally stumbles upon a stack of romance novels hidden in the shop. The pen name looks so familiar, and then he opens it up. The main characters equate to him and Aziraphale. It was a well-known fact that Crowley did not read, or rather, he did not prefer to read over anything else he may be doing. No one would ever find him curled up in a chair by the fireplace, sipping at a warm beverage with an Austen novel open before him. They'd more likely find him gluing pennies to the sidewalk, or screaming at said pennies after tricking him into their devilish deception days later. Sure, he could appreciate a few witty lines, and he had grown a certain fondness for the smell of books over the years he spent around them with a glass of wine. Funny stuff, by the way, especially when it makes someone like him appreciate books. But Crowley was just not the type of demon to crack open a novel just for the fun of it. He did, however, enjoy reading the sparse drafts scattered around the bookshop. There weren't many, and they consisted of no more than a few lines of prose each, but they were special, because they were written in Aziraphale's handwriting on just about everything, from napkins to the back of envelopes, and they were obviously not quoted from any other books in the shop. At first, Crowley suspected they may have been. Aziraphale was known to quote his favorite lines from authors he knew every once in a while. After all, why would it be so weird for him to write down the particularly interesting ones for later? But that was before he had found one with details just a little too specific to be from any novel that had been written decades ago. Details like ponds and ducks. Details like red hair and fast cars and burning churches. Details like hellhounds and flaming swords and every other biblical encounter in between. And the worst part? They were good. Sure, Crowley didn't read, but he could read. He knew prose when he saw it, and he could appreciate art. He only spoke of it once, when both of them were in the back drinking, as they often did. It was some year when colored television had not yet been invented, and the Bentley was only a decade or so off the lot. Sometime in the early 20th century, after they had begun talking to one another again, of course. You know, I'm a bit surprised you haven't entered the writing business by now. His eyes were not looking at Aziraphale, and therefore did not catch the look of surprise, instead focused on pouring more wine into his cup. I mean, what, with the bookshop and all? Thought you'd add some of your own. He placed the bottle on the table and leaned back into the couch, his head tilted toward Aziraphale, who was regarding him with a hesitant expression. Yes, well, he said, then apparently did not see it fit to continue as he took a drink from his glass. Well, yes. Crowley frowned. It can't be that hard for you, you know, because you're all... He waved a hand towards Aziraphale's general vicinity. You know, you like books and all that. That is true, Aziraphale said slowly, glancing away. But I'm afraid writing is a bit of a different field than reading. How so? Aziraphale gave him one of those looks, the one that he always wore when they were out in the park and Crowley was saying something very rebellious, like he was about to engage in some conspiracy. He held eye contact for a second before breaking away with a huff. Well, for starters, writing requires a certain amount of creativity, something my angels and demons profoundly lack, you know. Yeah. Can't get an angel to dance and all that. Crowley raised an eyebrow at him. Aziraphale looked at him strangely. I'm not sure what you mean. Never mind. So what about this writing business anyhow? You're just not going to try? Oh, I have tried, dear boy. Aziraphale smiled and sat up straighter. In fact, it's a rather enjoyable pastime, especially because all these strange phrases just appear in my mind every now and then. It is convenient to put them somewhere. His smile suddenly became strained as he said, I'm afraid there's nothing you'd like to read of it, though. It's more of a hobby than anything. I would never call myself a writer. Nah, said Crowley. I think it's more of a self-identifying kind of thing. Well, then I don't identify as a writer, and that's that. Aziraphale made a slapping motion with one hand on his thigh, like a gavel saying, "Case closed," then dunked back the remaining bit of wine in his glass. "That's that," Crowley echoed, watching as the angel reached shakily for the bottle. But it hadn't been. Because nearly a century later, after the world had nearly ended, and after he finally had a best friend who would stay, Eddie didn't feel quite so cold all the time anymore. He found it. He found the manuscript. An entire book just lying in the back of a drawer, not even bound together, in Aziraphale's handwriting. And the worst part, it wasn't even signed in his name. Instead, near the top was a title, Someone to Tell, Volume 7. And wasn't that strange enough, a title like that, and a name? But instead of Aziraphale, or A.Z. Fell, or even a somewhat understandable Brother Francis, there in black ink sat a perfectly innocent Eliza Fellows. Crowley did a double take at that one. Eliza Fellows. He knew that author. Didn't Aziraphale own several of theirs? Since when did he own their manuscript? Crowley stood there for a moment over Aziraphale's desk with the pile of papers in his hands. Then, just as quickly as he would have evaded a pedestrian on the street, he shot to the back of the shop, where he thought he saw the name several years ago. Of course, you could never know where anything was in the bookshop. Aziraphale made sure that everything was placed regularly into an order that only he could ever know. It could be in any order, like the second letter of the author's middle name, or even the date in which he met them, depending on what he felt like that week. However, luckily for Crowley, he seemed to not have moved these ones, for as he scrutinized the shelf, a blue spine with the words, "Someone Like Alex, Volume 1, by Eliza Fellows," caught his eye. Beside that one was a whole array of other books, as well, from Feelings on Wings to The Dealings of Roses. They seemed to be a series, as each cover became a slightly darker blue, until it faded into brown, and then red. Each one had a number on the spine, 1 to 6. Crowley grabbed at the first one, Someone Like Alex, and looked at the title printed in silver on the front. It must have been nearly a century old by now, judging the stained pages and the crack of the spine as he opened it to the first chapter page. Bollocks was the first word I ever said. I had only turned 10 months old, and my mother had taken to leaving the telly on the local news channel, thinking the colors would entertain me, even if the weather reports could bore a country grandmother. Unfortunately, she had failed to account for the sports section of the program, where guests were notorious for their foul language on live television, where the footage could not be altered. I had taken a liking to a particular announcer named James, whose voice sounded gravelly, like my dad, and who had a Cambridge accent. One of his signature phrases involved a lot more swearing than I could understand, but he always made sure to emphasize any words that had some sort of sexual origin. To my 10-month mind, the emphasized bollocks never failed to send me into a fit of laughter. When my mother had come back into the room just as James was introducing the games of the day, she grabbed the dial of the telly to turn it off so that I could nap. "That's enough news for the day, don't you think?" she said, as she picked me up. "Now off you get to bed." "Bollocks!" I cried into her shoulder, just as James would when he was frustrated. My mother nearly dropped me in fright. Her green eyes grew wide like golf balls, and her skin paling to the fine sheen of paper as she rushed me to the other room with sharp words on her lips. When I said my first word, I also tasted soap for the first time. Crowley stared at the book, at the open space beneath the passage which signified a new section being written. What in all of the chaos of the world did he just read? He flipped a few pages to chapter 16 and began reading again. When I realized my boot was running with river water, I let out a curse. So much for staying dry, I thought to myself, as I unlaced my shoes and placed them by the fire. "You done fussing yet?" Alex called from behind me. He had snuck back into the room sometime in my mental absence, and had taken place leaning against the wall with one hip jutting to the side. "It's like you've never stepped into a river before," he laughed. "Oh, be quiet," I muttered. I was busying myself with stuffing the laces into my boots. When I sat back, I whined out a faint, "My hair is all wet too. How did that even happen?" Alex hummed in consideration, and I could see his squint from the corner of my eye. "I'll get a towel," he said finally, then disappeared back into the corridor. This time, Crowley did not bother to read to the end of the page. He closed the book with a finalizing smack and looked up at the shelf. "I'm sure he won't notice," he said, before snapping his fingers. The line of books on the shelf disappeared, as did the one in his hand, along with the manuscript. Crowley may not like to read, but he sure did like getting answers. "Ah, fuck," Crowley groaned as he placed the blue book onto his desk. He was not in the habit of reading for long stretches of time, and therefore reading an entire book in one sitting was like staring into a bright light for hours. In fact, he had gained quite the headache after he passed chapter 17. He rubbed at the space between his eyes, sliding his glasses back over them from where he had placed them on his head. This Eliza person knew how to write, but why did it have to be so personal? As Crowley read, he couldn't help but feel like each page was mocking him, and the characters were just puppets of the worst moments of his life. There was even a church scene where the protagonist, apparently his name was Pietro, nearly died from some disciple with a knife. Crowley checked the date halfway through. Apparently this book was written in 1943. Funny, that was. But maybe the author just liked church scenes, yeah? And maybe they just happened to write about strict families and running away with a stranger and later love interest. A potential stranger and later love interest who happened to be the only one of the two with a car, and who had a peculiar way of walking and leaning against everything, and who wore sunglasses indoors, and who definitely snuck glances at Pietro whenever he thought the other was too engrossed in a newspaper. Oh, who was Crowley kidding? He knew who Aziraphale was. He wasn't so dense not to notice the parallels or how the manuscript found in Aziraphale's desk was in Aziraphale's handwriting. Now he just had to bring it up. Should probably tell him, he muttered to himself in the quiet room. It's common decency, and it's not like I'd be especially nice about it. I mean, how else should I react to finding out my best friend has been writing me and him snogging for nearly 80 years? Thanking him? Actually... Wait, no, that was a rubbish thought. He had to bring it up, right? He basically just read Aziraphale spilling out his entire ethereal heart in ink, practically throwing up hearts onto the paper all addressed to him. He couldn't go back to normal after that. He had to say something. Or maybe he didn't. Crowley groaned and let his head drop down to the desk. Yeah, no way in hell was he tackling this one.